Now I want to ask another question, and I think this may be our last guiding question for this lecture, which is what then happens to the old ways? Returning to the question from the start of the lecture of, if religion is the thing which binds your whole society and worldview together, what happens when that religion is replaced, supplanted, transformed? What occurs? And as we'll see, a lot of different things can occur, and it depends on the society, but there's a few patterns we can see. So again, you had traditions since time immemorial, you had rapid Christian conversions. What became of the tradition? To some degree, answering that can only sort of be answered by looking at specific places in specific areas. So here I want to talk about Yupik Russian Orthodox Yupik people, and specifically, let's narrow down even a little bit more. Russian Yupik Orthodox people in the areas close to Bristol Bay. So there's a reading that I didn't have you do, but it's from Alan Boris and Dr. Catherine Knott, and they were doing research as part of the process by which the EPA was investigating the environmental effects of the proposed Bristol Bay mine. And in their research paper which they produced, they went into great depth about the different ways in which Yupik people in the Bristol Bay region are connected to the water resources. And one of the things they talk about is the significant religious ways in which people are connected to those resources. So we're talking about Yupik communities which are predominantly Russian Orthodox, and where the Russian Orthodox priest and church are largely sort of the spiritual center of the community. And so Boris and Knott talk about a number of ways in which water is still honored within those traditions. They specifically talk about a Russian Orthodox ceremony which is done on the day of Theophany, January 6th, which is a religious celebration day within Russian Orthodoxy. If I'm not mistaken, and I'm not an expert on Russian Orthodoxy, but if I'm not mistaken, it commemorates the day in which, in the Bible, Jesus was baptized. And God pronounces from the heavens, or rather God the Father pronounces from the heavens, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And the Holy Spirit descends like a dove. And so it's this very important event within this early stories of Jesus. And so you have the Theophany ceremony, and within that you have what's called the Great Blessing on the Water, in which a Russian Orthodox priest uses a cross to do the sign of the cross over water and bless the water and make it holy and make it free of impurities or sins. And specifically here in Alaska, this Russian Orthodox priest in this Bristol Bay area does that over waters that are within that watershed, like rivers, right? So he's not just blessing sort of water in the church, but actually blessing a river to be clean and pure and holy. And then people gather up water at that moment, and it's holy water that they can keep in a bottle. And people will tell stories of one time we ran out of medicine, we didn't have any medicine, my kid was really sick, and I gave my kid this holy water, and my kid healed, right? Or the priest talks about one time when he got very frostbite and applied water to his whole face, and then his whole face was miraculously all right, except for the one little part of his face that he hadn't put holy water on. And so it's this ceremony in which water becomes potently powerful. But as Boris and Knott point out, what's interesting about that, other than just it's interesting in its own regard, right? It's a fascinating kind of ceremony, but it's interesting because there's definitely Yupik and Dena'ina traditions about the sacredness of water that in this region, in this Bristol Bay region, that go back long before Russian Orthodoxy was ever around. So that ceremony is not from native people. It's originally from Russian Orthodoxy, and it's done in other parts of the world too. But it's interesting that it sort of melds well with and merges with local beliefs about sacredness of water, which brings up a point that I often like to bring up when we talk about religious change, which is that oftentimes people are most accepting of or kind of latch onto things in the new religion that kind of resonate with the old religion. They find points where they match up and harmonize, right? People don't just throw out the entire thing whole cloth, but oftentimes keep aspects of it, or perhaps especially latch on to parts of the new religion that sort of harmonize with things that they already believed. And so that ceremony is one that people look forward to with a lot of happiness and joy, and one that's taken really seriously and seems to form kind of a prominent part of their specific way of practicing Russian Orthodoxy. And that shouldn't be too surprising, since water has been sacred in that region for a long time. So it's interesting how sort of the indigenous religion in that case is, in a strange way, sort of still persisting, even as folks have really truly converted over to Russian Orthodoxy. They also talked in that report about the first salmon prayers. So traditionally, you were supposed to do a prayer or a ceremony when the first salmon was caught for you for that year. And that was to allow the salmon to return because you've shown proper respect to them. Again, that reoccurring idea that respect equals return. But what's interesting now is that that's still done by many Yupik fishers. And many folks there are fishers. It's still done by Yupik fishers. But it's, in a sense, Christianized in the sense that when people do the prayer, they'll often pray to God in the Christian sense of that term. But people will also regularly, they'll readily say that the animals have spirits, the salmons have spirits, and that we need to respect the salmon. And it's not that that is not allowed in Christianity. There's not a part of the Bible that says sort of, animals don't have spirits or something. But a lot of, some Christians believe that and some don't because the Bible's not entirely clear on that. But Yupik Russian Orthodox people are very clear on that. And Boris they believe that it's because they're sort of drawing on and influenced by their pre-Christian religious traditions, which still have been sort of those teachings and those values have been transmitted and passed down. We have to remember that a worldview is more than one thing. It's not just the belief of how things are, but it's also the belief about values. And oftentimes values keep going even when the doctrines or the dogmas have changed that underlie those values. And so in this case, you have value systems towards the animals that have persisted, as well as sort of ideas about respect and return that are still there, but now sort of placed into a theistic or Christian frame. This isn't a great example of syncretism, but maybe a little bit. So let me explain the concept of syncretism, because whether or not we would put what I was just describing under it, it's a useful term to think about when you think about Alaska Native religious changes. So syncretism is or we sometimes say hybridity. Syncretism is the idea of religions blending together. Sometimes one gets kind of subsumed under another. Other times you just sort of have interesting combinations. So as an example, when we talk about religions such as Vodou or Santeria in the Caribbean, as well as in various parts of the southern United States, those religions share elements of both Catholicism and West African Yoruba pre-Christian practices that have sort of blended together over time, specifically during slavery. And so syncretism is two religions that blend together and either produce a new religion or oftentimes produce one or the other, right? Christianity and something else, and then the people end up being Christianity, but the something else is still part of it. And so that's the idea of syncretism. And indeed, if we think of it, when we start thinking of terms of syncretism or hybridity, or the term localization I have here, which localization is kind of putting a local spin on a global religion. And I think the salmon and great blessing on the water that I just talked about is an example of Yupik people kind of putting their own specific Bristol Bay kind of spin on Russian Orthodoxy. When we think about localization, hybridity, and syncretism, we start to realize that it's not as simple as flipping a light switch when a group of people change their religion. It's not either total rejection or total conversion. It's not either they were this and now they're that, or now they're that and now they're this. It's not like that. It's not black and white. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. But other times you see a lot of these meldings and creative blendings. And even if people think, oh, yeah, we've left our old ways behind, oftentimes the old ways still persist. And other times people know that they've kept the old ways around and they honor that, and they honor both the old ways and the new ways. Now, all of that sounds rather, shall we say, rosy, right? Sort of Christianity and the old traditions have sort of formed a creative, beautiful synthesis that flowers into these kind of religious traditions honoring salmon and water and things nowadays. But that's not to say that religious conversion is not also without trauma. And sometimes it's a response to trauma, and sometimes it itself is traumatic. The Napoleon Reading kind of talks about religion as the going over to Christianity for Yupik communities as a response to trauma. So in the Napoleon Reading, to be brief about it, he kind of makes an extended argument where he says that in the wake of the Great Death, the Yupik people in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, were in they had lost many of their people, including many of their knowledge holders, right? So for religion to keep going, you need the people that hold the knowledge about it, and have your community dies off, presumably at least some of the religious teachings do. Some of the shamans were dead at that point, right? Quite a few of them, in fact. But also the people had sort of lost faith in the shamanic-based religion. And so you have this time period where so much of the community had died from smallpox and measles and influenza, measles and influenza. And then you had the survivors. And as Napoleon argues that it was really kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder for an entire culture, because they had been through something very traumatic and they sort of had to shut themselves off, and they had a lot of anguish and stress about it. And as he said, around, they started to talk in terms of nalungwak, the idea of pretending things didn't happen, not talking about bad things that happen in your community. And as he puts it, the people at that time, they looked to priests for guidance. They turned to Christianity for guidance because they were in such disarray. But at the same time, I think I get a sense from the reading that he may or may not, he might actually be himself Christian. So I don't think he's trying to be critical necessarily, but I think he kind of presents the case that didn't entirely satisfy their needs. They were still sort of spiritually lost. And indeed, he says that he had met a lot of folks from these different communities that struggled with alcoholism, that struggled with abuse, that struggled with a lot of different things, that struggled with how they treated themselves. And he said, the disease is not physical. He says, whether or not there's any sort of genetic difference, he says, this disease isn't physical. He says that it's spiritual, and the cure must also be of the spirit. So his opinion is the response to this huge cultural trauma, the spiritual trauma of the traditional religion not working. And even though they'd converted to a new religion, they still were kind of experiencing this trauma in multiple ways: trauma of the people they'd lost, trauma of their religious system breaking down, trauma of being told that their religious system was evil. And so when the kids would ask about the religious dances or ceremonies or teachings, basically telling the kids like, no, that's bad stuff, that's the old stuff. And so the trauma for the kids of this first generation of learning that their culture is like evil or bad, or at least their old culture, their ancestors' culture. And as he says it, we kind of really have to think of it as Yupik culture before and Yupik culture after. As of course, it's still Yupik culture, but it's sort of these two very different phases, almost entirely different, based on the trauma that happened. And as a result, you had people turning inward, not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to deal with the grief of what have happened to their culture and to their communities. And he says, in that context, a lot of people turned to alcohol or to other behaviors, or they had a lot of pent-up anger, and pent-up anger can manifest as a lot of different negative behaviors. And he says, when that happens, then you have the next generation that's affected by those negative behaviors, and sort of that cycle goes on. And his argument is that until we sort of have a reckoning, until we sort of get it all out in the open and talk through the trauma we've experienced as a culture, he said, for some of these communities, they're going to keep having these issues. And he does a good job of pointing out this isn't by any stretch of the imagination all Alaska Native people, but, that there is a percentage there, in some of these communities where you have definitely a higher than average rate of these kinds of negative behaviors. And he says, there's a reason for that, and we can't just think of it as a health thing, and we can't just even think of it as an individual thing. We have to think of it as kind of in terms of the cultural trauma and spiritual trauma as the old ways collapsed, that sort of had reverberations through several generations. And that's not just, I don't think that's just Harold Napoleon saying that. There's been some really good, that's been a theme that's come up in a lot of different writings by scholars, by indigenous scholars, but also anthropologists, of all different stripes, of sort of the ways in which when groups are marginalized over several generations, or when they go through the trauma of colonialism, the way that can result in substance abuse, among other issues. So, a hard note to end on, but just to suggest that rapid religious change can be sometimes something where you find really beautiful kind of synthesis and syncretism and hybridity. On the other hand, it can sometimes be a sign that a community has been through an incredible amount of trauma, and that's why they sort of switched over to something else. And that kind of trauma may not have ever been fully resolved by that switching over, and there may still be those legacies of trauma as the old ways were sort of collapsed in some communities. And in other communities, that's not the case at all. We should think of Harold Napoleon's findings as, specific to the communities he is most familiar with. All right, well, I hope this was an interesting lecture. I think these are really important issues to think about how complex and interesting and complicated religion is, and that it's never quite as simple as, well, they were, Alaska Native communities were one way and now they're a different way. It's oftentimes a lot more of a complicated picture. At the same time, I hope we can kind of honor and pay attention to the fact that, when we're interacting with Alaska Native people, whether that's ourselves, if we are Alaska Native, or whether that's other people, we honor and respect that there's spiritual sacred traditions going back millennia and centuries that we honor and respect, and also acknowledge, that in some cases these traditions were very much silenced and subjugated, and that we also honor and respect that for many Alaska Native people today, their predominant spiritual orientation, for some people, still leans towards their pre-Christian traditions, and for some people leans very strongly towards Christianity, and for some people leans towards some kind of blending of the two. But whatever it is, you can be sure that for a lot of people, that's an important part of who they are, because it's part of what binds their world together. So whether these folks that we're talking about, whether you have an Alaska Native village where a lot of folks are Episcopalian or Russian Orthodox or practicing traditional shamanism, whatever the case may be, that we honor and respect the really rich spiritual diversity that is Alaska. Okay, thanks a lot.